Okay, so hello and thanks for joining us for today's webinar from the Institute for Research on Poverty at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I'm Dave Chancellor. So today we are going to be talking about the expanded child tax credit and some related components of the American Rescue Plan. And we're going to hear about what some of the updates to this credit are, its projected impact on poverty and child poverty, and some of the challenges of delivering this credit to low-income families, especially those that may not have received the credit in the past. And we've got a great panel of presenters with us today, and I'm so happy to be able to introduce Elaine Maag of the Urban-Brookings Tax Policy Center, Megan Curran of the Columbia University Center on Poverty and Social Policy, and Sarah Halpern-Meekin, who is an IRP affiliate and professor in the School of Human Ecology here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So I appreciate all of you being here. I also want to acknowledge the Office of the Assistant Secretary for Planning and Evaluation at the Department of Health and Human Services for their support of this webinar series. That said, any positions expressed in today's webinar aren't necessarily those of ASPE or the Institute for Research on Poverty. So with that, Elaine Maag, you are a principal research associate in the Urban-Brookings Tax Policy Center, and you've previously served at the IRS and the Government Accountability Office. So thanks so much for being here, and I'm going to turn it over to you now if you want to start sharing your slides.
Thanks so much. I am delighted to be here speaking with such amazing women. So thank you for organizing that. I have been tasked with sort of the Child Tax Credit 101. So I hope to sort of explain what's happening right now, how it differs from the past, and why those changes might be important, particularly for low-income families. So it's a federal tax credit. And rather than being $2,000 per child under age 17, it's grown. So this year you can get $3,000 per child, and 17-year-old children will be eligible for the first time. That $3,000 will be $3,600 if your child's under age 6. There's no limit on the number of children that can receive benefits in any given family. All low-income citizen children are eligible for the full credit. That was done by making the credit fully refundable. And that means that even if you don't owe taxes, even if you don't earn income, you can get the maximum credit. The credit does phase out at higher income levels. And importantly, it builds on an existing credit. So I think there's some question out there. If we're going to deliver a broad benefit, why are we looking at the tax system instead of the transfer system? And my number one answer is that it was done quite quickly, and we needed to build on something that already existed. And the tax system, as it turns out, already provides benefits to families and children with children, almost all of them. And that number will just increase by those very low income families that used to not get a credit. So I drew a picture of the old credit and the new credit to sort of make this a little more clear. So this yellow line here is what I did not discuss before. It's totally unchanged. If you have a child that is a dependent, so maybe they're a student ages 19 to 24, maybe they do not have an SSN, but they're a resident in the United States, you can get a credit for other dependents. It's not refundable. So you'll see if you have low income, you don't receive the credit. The old child tax credit is this gray line. And because this is a temporary change, it's going to return to that after this year, absent legislative action. So what used to happen is you had to earn $2,500, and then each dollar you earned would make you eligible for a little bit more credit. But there was a feature of the law that said at most you can receive $1,400 of this credit as a refund, even though you can see if you were higher income, you could actually get $2,000 per child. Well, poverty researchers sort of looked at this with a little bit of surprise, thinking, why are we sending money to high and middle income families with children, and we're leaving out the most vulnerable children? And so that was the critical change that was made in this legislation, and the most important thing for low income families with children. So if your child, as I said, is between ages 6 and 16, you can get a credit of up to $3,000 per child. It does phase out. So if you're a single parent, once your income reaches about $112,000, it starts to decline until it hits the value of your old credit. And then that credit also will phase out once your income reaches $200,000. Those levels are higher if you're in a married couple. And this red bar is if your child is under 6. And that's based on good research that shows if you get money in children's households, particularly when they're very young, you can see a lifetime of benefits. So as many people know, when the federal tax changes, the state taxes can also change. And that's because there's linkages between state and federal tax systems. They do this largely to lighten the administrative burden on the state agencies that are administering the system, but it also makes it easier for individuals to file their state taxes because a lot of the information they've already provided on their federal return. Unlike the earned income tax credit, which I think probably many in this audience know about, where many, many states have linked to the federal credit, only Oklahoma has a direct link to the federal child tax credit. So other states do have child tax credits, but they're calculated separately from the federal credit. So Oklahoma families can expect to receive an average bump of about $100 per child, not because anything in the Oklahoma law changed, but because the federal tax law changed. The other interaction I almost hate to mention because it's confusing. There will be some people who will actually owe more in state taxes because what happens is in some states, many of them, you can deduct, if you itemize your deductions, how much state tax you pay. And if you're paying, or how much federal tax you pay on your state return. So if you are paying less federal tax, you have a smaller deduction, so you'll owe more state tax. On average, families will owe about $115 more if they're a person that's affected by this. But overall, they are still much, much better off with the federal child tax credit in place because those benefits average $2,700 per family with children. So this figure compares why, or sort of highlights why the law was changed to affect those low income children. So the dark blue bars are what the child tax credit looked like before the passage of the American Rescue Plan. And the brighter bars, the ones on the right, is what the benefits of the Rescue Plan child tax credit look like. So what we do at Tax Policy Center a lot is we take the whole population, we stack it from the lowest income person to the highest income person. And then we divide that into 5 equal parts. And we call those, quintiles. So the lowest quintile are those people that are in the bottom 20% of that stack of people I described. And what used to happen is on average, families with children in the bottom income quintile receive just over $1,000 of benefit from the child tax credit. Now, under the new rules, they'll receive more than $4,000 per family. Why is it more than the individual, $3,000 or $3,600? That's because many families have more than one child, so the averages are higher. These estimates assume that there will be a few people who are not filing tax returns and don't get the benefit. So if everyone actually received the benefit, you'd see that bar bump up closer to that second and third income quintiles. So the other thing that's important about this is that whether you're in the first, second, third, or fourth income quintile, your benefits are pretty similar under the American Rescue Plan version of the child tax credit, but that wasn't true before. You can see it used to be a credit that was really directed toward those middle income families, and then high income families, just as in the past, they receive on average smaller credits, although the difference is more severe now. And that's because there's that second phase out. So high income families aren't getting that $3,000 per child or the $3,600 per child. They're still getting the maximum benefit of $2,000 per child. So there's also not just a change in how we calculate the credit, but there's a big administrative change. So I want to walk you through what you're familiar with, and that's claiming your child tax credit in a typical year. So usually what happens is you complete a tax return, and what we just completed in 2021 was actually our 2020 tax returns. So we added up all the income over 2020, and then we calculated how much credit we qualified for. We subtracted that from taxes owed. And then if there was a difference, so I was owed more credit, more child tax credit than I owed in taxes, I could receive the difference as a refund, and that would be up to $1,400 per child. For low-income families, this is how they access the child tax credit, because there's no way to deliver it throughout the year. Now that's changed. What we're doing is we're advancing the 2021 credits. So we won't really know who's eligible for the 2021 credit until those returns come in early 2022. But based on information that's in your 2019 or 2020 return, those payments are going to start coming out. They're going to deliver half of your credit starting in July. There is an option to opt out. And if you are curious, you might have received a letter from the IRS in the last few weeks. That letter, that's my dog, sorry. That letter tells you that the IRS has your information. This is how many children they think you have in your household, and they're going to start delivering payments. If there's something incorrect in that letter, there's going to be a portal put up on the IRS website for you to correct that information. So why did we do this? This is complicated to advance credits based on guesswork largely. The real reason is we're trying to match timing of payments to when people actually need them. So I did some earlier work with Liz Peters and Sarah Edelstein. And what we found is that nearly 40% of low-income working age adults have household income that spikes above or dips below their average monthly income in at least 6 months of the year. And so what I liken this to is many low-income families are not low income because they have a steady paying job in every month of the year. They're low income because their incomes are bouncing around. They're coming in and out of the labor market. They might be affected by seasonal work. In this past year, they might have been affected by, their jobs closing down in the service sector. And so they face a lot of volatility, and that makes meeting your basic needs on a month-to-month basis more difficult. So if we can deliver this relatively large benefit throughout the year, we can help people meet their basic needs. The problem, of course, is that the IRS can be wrong. So they might send the wrong amount of payments because you have a different number of children in your house than they thought you would have. Maybe you got divorced. Life happens. And so there is a risk of overpayment. And there's also, I should say, an increased administrative complexity. So this is a really big challenge for the IRS. They don't typically send out, monthly checks to folks or direct deposit. And so in this 1-year piece of legislation, they do make it so that if you're low income and you receive a payment that turns out to be an error, it's unlikely you'll have to pay it back, or at least you won't have to pay the full amount back. And that's a safe harbor, similar to what we do with the premium tax credits. So my takeaways from this are that the expansion of the existing child tax credit, it distributes a full 1/4 of new benefits to very low income families. This is the only change in this 18-year legislative history with the child tax credit that has targeted such a large share of new benefits to very low income families. So it's a really big departure from how we've treated this credit in the past. It's going to provide benefits for the lowest income families with children on par with benefits from middle income families. That's also new. But it's really important to remember that these are all temporary changes. It's a 1-year change to the law, and absent legislative action, the credit will go back to its former self at the turn of the calendar. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Elaine. And I just want to let folks know that you're also going to be on another kind of web panel tomorrow with Rucker Johnson, Robert Moffett, and Michael Strain. And I think that's being hosted by the American Academy of Political and Social Science and Spotlight on Poverty and Opportunity. So people can look for that if you'd like to hear more from Elaine. So our next presenter is Megan Curran, who is the Director of Policy at the Columbia University Center on Poverty and Social Policy. So Megan, thank you so much for being here. And among other things, I mean, a lot of things, you are part of a team that's doing a lot of really important work, I think, in projecting poverty levels that kind of respond in terms of how things might respond to policy changes and other events that we're seeing. And so I just want to encourage folks to go check out all the things that you and your team are putting on your website there. So, but I'll turn it over to you now. And if you want to share your slides, the floor is yours.
Sure, thanks so much. Okay, so Yeah, as Dave mentioned, my colleagues and I at the Center on Poverty and Social Policy at Columbia have been working over the past, I guess, year and a half now, trying to basically track, the impact of the current crisis, but also the impact of what all of these new policy responses mean in terms of poverty. So just a quick shout out to the colleagues that I'm really fortunate to work with. Everything I'm going to present today has really been the result of a group effort. So Sophie Collier, Rob Hartley, Jordan Matsudaira, Zach Parolin, Jane Wolfogel, and Chris Weimer. So I'll just so just to say, for a bit of context here, as I'm going to be talking a bit about poverty and the policy impacts, just to kind of, set the scene that it matters what measures we're talking about. So the team that I mentioned earlier, we've been actually, looking at poverty in new ways over the course of the last, 15, 16 months or so. The traditional way that we look at poverty is, using annual data that is available from the Census Bureau, but it's kind of summing up what families have had available in terms of income, but also benefits and things like that. But of course, it's looking, at kind of a retrospective glance, and so that information comes on a lag. So it's usually in the fall of, say, 2020, that you would get the picture of what family incomes looked like across the U.S. for the whole of 2019. We use the supplemental poverty measure. So again, just to say that that differs from the official poverty measure in that it takes a fuller account of taxes and transfers. So it accounts for tax credits that we're particularly concerned with today, other sort of cash and non-cash supports that families might receive. And it also sort of adjusts, for how many people you have in your family, and adjusts for where you live in the country. So the SPM offers such a valuable tool for trying to assess the impact of, say, what the child tax credit was doing for, tackling poverty among the families who received it beforehand, but we didn't have necessarily sort of real-time information. So what my colleagues and I have been trying to also kind of look at is just some new tools, and they are a work in progress. But the first was really to try and get a sense of what families might be experienced in terms of poverty on a monthly basis, because we know that as the COVID crisis unfolded, how families were faring really depended on what point in the year. Last year in particular, you were talking about, was it back in the spring when unemployment rose sharply, but also, important pieces of the CARES Act, like those stimulus checks and expansions to unemployment benefits kicked in? Or was it later in the year when actually some of those checks had been spent? The $600 a week unemployment benefits started to expire, things like that. So we started to see some of those trends when you look at a monthly basis. But we also tried to get a sense of what a whole year picture, so the traditional annual poverty look, in a little bit, again, more of a real time. So kind of trying to understand what might 2021 look like, even though we're kind of still in the middle of it, and into the near future. So what might poverty in 2022 look like if we have, different policies in place? So looking at the monthly piece, you can see this is a chart that looks back at January 2020 and each month up through May 2021. So the dark blue line looks at what child poverty, this is looking at just for kids under the age of 18, what child poverty could have looked like had the federal government taken no action to deliver COVID relief. So unsurprisingly, basically between March and April, when the pandemic really hit and the impacts were being felt in the US economy with shutdowns, you would have seen a huge spike in child poverty just in that 1 month period. The lighter blue line is what we've been tracking as to what our estimates are of what monthly poverty look like for children with all of the different COVID pieces in place. So you can see that, one of the key takeaways here is actually that policy matters. Getting cash to families makes a difference. What we see is that it essentially blunted, what could have been, a horrific rise in child poverty during this period. But one of the other takeaways from this image, when you look at child poverty on a monthly basis rather than the annual basis, is that you see kind of some odd dips here. So around springtime of 2020 and early spring of 2021. And what this represents essentially, as the labels show you, is right now when the large share of family tax credits, the earned income tax credit in particular, and also the prior version of the child tax credit, when these tax refunds are available to families. So right now, as Elaine was saying, that the prior version delivered these on a once a year sort of at tax time after families filed their taxes. So this obviously looks, really important on a monthly basis. It's great that poverty declines in that month when families are receiving these funds. But we also see that, poverty tends to go right back up the next month. So we anticipate, as the new version, the new temporary version of the child tax credit is rolled out, that perhaps, it hasn't happened yet, but perhaps there could be some smoothing of these poverty rates over the months as families are able to perhaps smooth some more of their, income received, smooth some more of their consumption. It will still be kind of a to be determined, because we know that, this new temporary child tax credit is going to be delivered partially in cash payments per month, but then still partially in a lump sum. But it's something to sort of, keep an eye on how this looks in terms of affecting how families fare over the course of the year. When we look at the whole year picture, though, again, kind of stepping back and returning to that annual framework and thinking that if we kind of take a sum of how many resources a family has available to them, for the entire annual period, we had looked at, our sort of forecasting work to try and get a sense of a little bit more in real time, what might 2021 look like? Because we have a sense now of what policies are going to be in place for the course of the year. And so if we, it depends on, the unemployment rate that you would have and things like that. But we created some projections of what 2021 could look like, essentially, had the American Rescue Plan, which was passed in March, not been in place, and with a number of key components of the American Rescue Plan. So over on the right-hand sidebar, you can see that we took 6 really sort of key income support elements of the Rescue Plan. The Rescue Plan is obviously much broader than this, but in terms of thinking about what's actually directly affecting families' bank accounts, these are 6 key pieces. Another round of the cash stimulus payments, continuing unemployment benefits with the $300 a week bump, expanding SNAP benefits to cover more food needs for families, and then in particular a number of tax credit changes. But what everyone on this event here is particularly concerned with today, this new version of the child tax credit that Elaine walked us through the new components. So essentially what we saw here is that if families receive what they're eligible for, this plan, all of these components together working in combination, could have real anti-poverty effects this year. Poverty for the whole US population could be reduced by about 1/3, and poverty among children, who we know, historically kind of have experienced poverty at higher rates than some other age groups, could be potentially cut in half. This is looking at within 2021, and for this whole set of package items sort of in combination. The problem, as Elaine mentioned, is that much of this work would be temporary. So this would be, a really meaningful historic sort of reduction in poverty across the country. But right now it would be on a very temporary basis. So we tried to look at what 2022, next year would look like, sort of without any extra information, or what if the administration's American Families Plan was put in place. So basically what we see is that in 2022, these gray bars for the US population and the child population, if no further action is taken, then next year poverty could rise back up to what it was sort of pre-pandemic levels. That the American Rescue Plan has this potential for significant poverty reduction, but if we sort of just let the pieces that are in place for this year expire, that progress will be lost. So within the American Families Fund, there's some overlap with the rescue plan, but there are different elements. There's obviously no more stimulus checks. We didn't account for any more continuation of expansions to unemployment benefits. But there are other pieces that sort of fill in some other gaps for families, like childcare expansions and things like that. But again, crucially, there would be a continuation of this improved and expanded version of the child tax credit. So what we're seeing here then is that essentially poverty, if we focus just on kids in 2022, could be sort of kept at this lower rate, that progress could potentially be sustained from this year. A lot of people, I looking at these in blue boxes on the right-hand side, again, to emphasize that these projections look at the combination of items together. But, very rightfully so, a lot of attention has been put on the new child tax credit. First of all, because it is such a meaningful change of the way that it used to be delivered, not just in terms of making regular payments available, but as Elaine had those nice charts in terms of those who are in the lower part of the income distribution, who used to be excluded from the full benefit, are now included. One of the biggest issues for poverty in the past was the fact that this is a lot of work led by my colleague Sophie Collier, showing that about 1/3 of all children in the US had actually used to be left out of the full child tax credit because they were in families where they didn't earn enough to basically qualify for that maximum $2,000 benefit. Part of the reason, was the way that was the refundability and things like that. But part of the reason is also because of the way that it phased in. It not only required you to have a certain level of earnings, but it also required families to actually earn more with each additional child in the family. This is a real quirk of the structure that I don't think it was probably not necessarily intentional, but when you had this sort of very complicated sort of earnings requirements and benefit phase in is actually just kind of what ended up happening. So a married couple with one child needed to earn about $30,000 in order to access the old version of the child tax credit. But if you actually had two children, you needed to earn more. You needed to earn $36,000 to access the full credit. If you had three children, you had to earn even more, over $40,000, and so on and so forth. So when we talk about the impact on poverty, we were leaving out families in this lower piece. And so one of the reasons why you see such a strong sort of anti-poverty effect of putting in these temporary expansions is because the credit wasn't necessarily doing enough to reach these families in the first place. We have looked at the child tax credit, what these types of expansions could look like on their own, because we know that legislation that had been introduced in both the House and the Senate prior to the crisis, even the American Family Act had many of these same proposals in it. It would have also, increased the maximum benefit to $3,000, and with that extra bump for young kids up to $3,600. It would also remove that sort of, weird phase in that made it very complicated for families to actually access the maximum benefit, and it would make it fully refundable. And so we found that, just the child tax credit on its own, this is looking in data that was from prior to the pandemic, could have a real meaningful impact on child poverty reduction in general. Basically could reduce child poverty by over 40% if children receive what they're eligible for. It would also have a particular impact on children in communities of color, in particular children in Black families, Latino children, and Native American children. And again, this is partially because children in these families were actually disproportionately left out of the child tax credit in its prior version. Some of those earnings requirements and phase-ins and things excluded, not just children in larger families because it phased in with the, each additional child, but it left out, children of color. It left out children in single-parent households more than children in married households, and it left children out actually in all parts of the country, but at significant rates in rural areas. And I can throw a link into the chat later. We looked at it by congressional district, and you saw huge amounts of kids left out in parts of New York City, but also, in parts of, say, Mississippi and Arizona and things like that. So this was not something that was only a problem for families in one part of the country. This was a problem all over. But the piece that I will leave with here, and actually I think it's a good transition to what Sarah is going to be talking about, is that all of these poverty estimates represent the potential for poverty reduction. But what I mean by potential is that this is what the new child tax credit could do. This is what the sort of American Rescue Plan as a whole and the proposed American Families Plan as a whole can do if families and children in particular who are now eligible for these new supports actually receive them. And of course, many of us on this call who work in, maybe in direct services with families or work in different parts of policy or advocacy or research know that, there's sometimes a big gap between something being signed into law and money actually being received by families sort of in their bank accounts or in their pockets. And so to achieve these, sort of potential poverty reductions, one of the biggest keys here is access. And I'll turn it over to Sarah because I think she'll walk us through some of the sort of current challenges, but also areas for opportunity in this area.
Megan, thank you so much for that. And so, and we look forward to hearing a little bit more from you during Q&A. So Sarah Halpern-Meekin, you're a sociologist here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison's School of Human Ecology, and you also have an appointment at the La Follette School of Public Affairs. Yeah, I just welcome to the webinar today, and thanks so much for being here and sharing this with us. So I'm going to turn it to you now.
Thanks, Dave. It's been a great opportunity for me to get to learn from Megan and Elaine, and I look forward to continuing the conversation with all of you afterward. So first, I want to focus on the little bit that we do know from previous research. I think a first question that I've often heard once we knew that the child tax credit was going to be expanded this year is, how will people use this money? That's driven in part by genuine interest, hoping that the money benefits people, but also in part because there tend to be stereotypes and biases around how low-income families and parents allocate money. So we know from previous research on the earned income tax credit, for example, that when money is earmarked as quote unquote children's money, and we sort of mentally think of it that way, it will often shape allocation decisions, with money being more likely perhaps to be spent on items that are directed at children. I don't want us to think of that as necessarily good or bad. Buying books for kids is great. Is it better than paying the electric bill? It probably depends on a family and its needs. And so really trying to put ourselves in a mindset where we're not thinking about the judgments we're making around how other people are allocating the money, but rather thinking about this as an opportunity for resources to be in parents' hands who can then make the decisions that fit the needs of their family, is I think how I try to view these resources. Another thing that we know from previous research on the earned income tax credit is that families are quite likely to spend their tax refund money, that includes the earned income tax credit and the refundable portion of the old child tax credit. Families were quite likely to spend that money on paying back bills and debts, paying current bills, and buying little special extras for children. As Elaine alluded to, this paying down back bills and debts is one motivation for having the credit be sent out across the course of the year, with the hope being that people could keep more current on their bills and then not have to face the sort of fees and things like that that come with being behind on bills, because they'll have a little more money in their pockets each month. So we know that that's how people have spent their tax refunds in the past. I think it's important to understand that the meaning of people's spending decisions to them and the amount of dollars they allocate to them don't always match. So for example, in research that we've done where we interviewed parents who've received the Earned Income Tax Credit and the Child Tax Credit, they talk about how fulfilling it is for them to be able to buy a special treat for their child. So that could be letting their kid pick out, name brand cereal in the grocery store. It could be the family having a meal at a sit-down restaurant for, a child graduating or something like that. And those things are enormously meaningful to them. That's not where most of their refund dollars go. And so as we think about money coming in for families, we want to think both about the utility those resources can have in paying for needs, but also the meaning that those dollars can have in helping parents enact the kind of childhood and the kind of family life they want their children to experience. In addition, this previous research tells us that families would use money to engage in debt repayment and sometimes in some sorts of asset building, often buying items like perhaps a used car, washer and dryer, maybe putting aside some emergency savings. I think it's an open question, the extent to which that is going to translate with this expanded child tax credit, because this previous research is based on families receiving a lump sum once a year at tax time. And we tend to think about lump sums of money and therefore allocate them differently than we think about periodic payments. So when we interviewed families about how they spent their tax refunds, they would say things like, it felt really like tax time was the time to get ahead in terms of paying down debt or in terms of savings, because you could take one big action and really feel like you made a difference, right? You really paid down your debt or you really put aside some savings. And that's enabled by the lump sum. And so it remains an open question how families will think about or approach their spending decisions when they're receiving some of these payments in monthly allocations rather than in one lump sum. They will still have that lump sum come tax time, since they will only be getting half of their child tax credit in those monthly payments during the year. So I want to focus on a few challenges that I'm thinking about that this distribution system might have for lower income families. We know, for example, that lower income families are less likely to have a secure relationship with a banking institution. That is, they're more likely to be unbanked or underbanked. So around nearly 1 in 6 lower income families is unbanked. That's compared to, it's 5 times higher than it is among middle and upper income families. And so low income families are just much less likely to be in the position where they can give that direct deposit information to the IRS and receive their money that way. And so that might mean they might not have that bank account information to provide. It might mean that the bank account information they provided for their 2020 taxes or their 2019 taxes is no longer accurate. And because families don't have that information, they might be relying on receiving the money through a paper check. And that, again, is a more difficult way to get money into families' hands, especially if families are dealing with housing mobility or housing insecurity, and therefore not at the same address they were previously. We also know that lower income families are less likely to have access to high-speed internet, as we all learned over this last year and a half when life went virtual. Families in rural areas in particular are likely to lack access to reliable high-speed internet that would be needed to access the IRS portal where they can enter or adjust their information. Low-income families are also less likely to have computers. They're more likely to be using cell phones to access the internet. Therefore, knowing how this system, this IRS portal works for families who don't have internet, obviously not so well, or for families who are using their cell phones, the last I heard was that it is not, the portal at this point is not yet compatible with cell phones, which represents a hurdle for families who might have that as their only way of accessing the internet. For current filers, as I'm sure many of you are aware of with families you work with or families you're in, there can be a number of challenges. So even though the payments for families who are already filing their taxes, even though those payments will come automatically, so the IRS will just rely on your previous information to calculate and send your child tax credit, so you don't need to do anything. There can be situations where the information families provided previously is no longer accurate. So families, we've just finished the 2020 tax season, but there can be changes from that 2020 tax season to what might be going on for families in 2021. We know, for example, that child custody arrangements can change in terms of who formally has custody of children, whether that's one parent or another, or a grandparent taking custody, et cetera. So those situations can change, and current filers would therefore not have their previous information be accurate. We also know that informal situations can change as well. So children's living situations, a child might go to live with another parent informally, and who is providing financial support to a child can also change, such that the requirement that a child live with a family for at least half the year and be providing substantial support to that child might change from year to year, requiring filers who are already in the system to update their information. We also know that real life arrangements are a lot more complex than the tax system allows. So in many ways, the tax system is built for the sort of normative, traditional family of, a mythical yesteryear that doesn't really exist for many people anymore, if it ever did. And so that means that the current tax system, even absent the expanded child tax credit, often doesn't totally fit for families. So unless two parents are married, they cannot both file and claim a child in one tax year. Only one filer can use one child's social security number in any tax year. And so that might mean that families who have one parent claim a kid one year and then expect to have the parent claim the child the next year are going to have to navigate all of these all of the facts that the system is not really set up to recognize the way that their family operates, which could be two parents living together in one house raising a child, but outside of marriage. This would similarly be challenging for a grandparent and an adult parent raising a child together. They can't file together as a tax unit. So we have lots of families who might struggle to sort of adapt the strictures of the tax system to the realities of their family life. For non-filers, that is people who didn't file taxes in 2019 and 2020, they'll face the same challenges that I just discussed as for filers, but they're going to need to take action in order to claim the child tax credit. So while it is opt-out for others, if you don't want to get it, you can go in and let the IRS know, otherwise they're going to send you money. It's opt-in for people who didn't file taxes previously in 2019 or 2020. So they'll be relying on people's 2020 information. If they don't have that, they'll look back at 2019. And if you don't exist in 2019 and 2020, you aren't in their system. Many people were brought into the system through outreach efforts trying to get stimulus checks to people who hadn't filed taxes recently. And so those folks might already have been identified and brought into the system, but that means that those who have not yet been reached are therefore the most difficult to reach. And so outreach efforts are even more important because the low-hanging fruit, as it were, is less likely to exist. The other thing that I think is important to highlight is this doesn't just require a one-time effort of having families input their information into the IRS's child tax credit portal, but rather they will need to file not just now to receive these monthly payments, but that only gets them half of their child tax credit. So they'll need to file taxes again in 2022 for the 2021 year in order to access the other half of their child tax credit. So we have a double lift that's sort of required to get families this money. So a few takeaways that I would highlight, just to echo what Megan was sharing. Organizations and state and local governments, as they've done for the earned income tax credit in the past, can help families to sign up for the child tax credit, both now in advance of the July 15th first monthly distribution, and then again at tax time when families can receive the other half of that expanded child tax credit. I think it's really important that there's ongoing attention to the user experience with the IRS portal. The higher the administrative burdens of using it, the higher the barriers to access, the harder it will be for families who are most vulnerable to access these resources. I think because this policy is new and because it's changing, we don't know what the future of it will be. It's going to take a while before we see how this money fits into families' financial management strategies. So this is going to be a different way for families to receive money this year. And the way that families adjust to it is probably going to depend in part on whether this is sort of a one-time, this is how money looks in 2021, or whether this is something they're supposed to get used to and therefore build budgets around. Finally, I really encourage folks to not just look at the impacts of this policy change on children and their families, but also on communities, because what this money is not just money going into families or being invested in children, but it's money that is being spent and experienced in communities. And so it can have a ripple effect, right? That money that goes into a family gets spent at local businesses, and that has a magnifying effect in communities. And so as we think about how these sorts of investments pay off, we can think about how they pay off at the individual level, at the family level, and also at the community level. I am going to go ahead and leave things there, and I look forward to our conversation.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Sarah. That was really, really helpful. And I think you covered a ton of ground in that bit there. So we've got a lot of questions coming in. And if folks have been paying attention to the chat, you can see that there are a lot of questions involving sort of interaction with other anti-poverty programs. And I want to kind of cover those live a little bit. So Elaine, would you be willing to kind of start us off there? What are some of the things, I think people have a lot of questions like how this might affect child support, housing assistance, things like that, SNAP eligibility. What do we know?
So generally, tax credits don't interact with your transfer benefits. The exception is if you end up creating an asset out of these this money, then eventually it can come up and for eligibility. But your SNAP benefit shouldn't change. Your child support order is unlikely to change. Your housing benefit shouldn't change. Taxes are just treated as totally separate. That's another reason why I think policymakers like to turn to the tax system, because it doesn't accidentally mess with other programs in place.
Okay. Did anyone else have anything you wanted to add to that there, Sarah or Megan?
No, I think it's just might be a really good point if anyone is working directly with families to just emphasize that with families that you might be talking to, just to overcome any potential hesitancy, because we know that other pieces of the safety net, the SNAP in particular, housing assistance in particular, are so crucial that you just want to alleviate any worry right off the bat that families might have and say, no, this is actually just extra money that you are now eligible for. It's not going to mess up other pieces.
We have an interesting question in Q&A, thinking about outreach for this credit. Obviously the White House has been doing a lot. We had Child Tax Credit Awareness Day on Monday, but in terms of localities and sort of like getting like sort of names and information about people that they want to send stuff to, so they can try to help them kind of secure this. From some of the social services side, they've got access to that information, but of course, the three of you as researchers know that gathering IRS information is more difficult, I understand. Is there been any talk about how that could work, and if there's any potential there of local organizations getting access to something that they could use to help do outreach?
So it's probably important to remember that the folks that we're most concerned about are non-filers. So the IRS doesn't know who they are. They don't know where these children are living necessarily. There's some information on health insurance forms, which I think could be very productive if people are allowed to use those for outreach. But most of the time the IRS is not the agency. Then the question is, well, why don't we go to the SNAP records or another social service program and start trying to find people that way? And although it should be simple, it's not. The data are not really set up to use in the same way as tax data are set up to use. And so it's a really big task. And will the IRS like release all their data and say match it to your SNAP records? No, I cannot imagine they would do that looking for people.
Just to emphasize what Elaine was saying. So, people's tax filing units, their households for tax purposes don't necessarily match their households for SNAP purposes, for example, right? So those examples I gave before of the cohabiting couple with raising children together, they are two separate tax filing units potentially. They could be one SNAP unit. And so even if you did have all of this data, because we calculate sort of the household unit differently for different programs, there's often a mismatch between those.
Megan, do you have anything you wanted to add there? Or if not, oh, go ahead, sorry. No, okay. So if not, Megan, I do want to go to you first on this next question. We've had a few comments and then a few questions as well. Kind of trying to think about the sort of the smoothing effect of this policy. Like, what is it going to look like, for it to show up monthly? I know we've seen in the chat here, folks are still going to get a lump sum payment for the EITC in the spring, likely. But help us to think about that both from, and Megan, maybe especially from a poverty measurement aspect, like what does that look like and how does that change how families might be sort of experiencing this?
Yeah, that's a good question. In terms of the sort of overall poverty numbers that I talked about and say what the American Rescue Plan could potentially achieve this year, that is looking at the annual framework. So that's saying, over the course of the 12 months of 2021, if you add up all of the different pieces, the extra stimulus checks, if a family happens to be receiving unemployment, plus a child tax credit, et cetera, that could be, some of those top line figures are the annual pieces. But as I did mention, we've been trying to track monthly poverty. And I think this offers us hopefully an extra tool to try and see what might be the effects, within the year. Because we know that, as Sarah was talking about, that, families, can benefit from like these large lump sum payments. But there's also, maybe sometimes some of that debt was incurred because, there wasn't regular resources available in the other 11 months of the year. And so when we look at our monthly poverty framework. So just to put into context, on an annual basis, if we're using the supplemental poverty measure, it varies very much, how big your family is and what part of the country you live in. But you could say a family of 4, 2 adults, 2 children in a sort of average cost city, we're talking about a poverty line of about $28,000 a year. So if you put that in a monthly framework, we're talking about, say, having about $2,300 a month to be able to sort of, if you're above that line, then you're technically above the poverty line on a monthly basis. So you could think about that if a family, again, has 2 children, they might be receiving now an extra $600 a month. In the context of having to get over that $2,300 poverty line, $600, actually could make a real difference, even if you're looking at it on that monthly basis. And so, we would be optimistic that you could see some of these monthly poverty trends shifting, maybe, hopefully lower them. But again, it's going to be, it's just a bit of an unknown. First, there might be some delays in families accessing them. Not all families might be up and ready and registered by July 15th. So we might see a delay in sort of the monthly impact. And of course, right now, it's only on this temporary basis of receiving these monthly payments through December. So, it's kind of a space to watch. But assuming families got what they were eligible for and assuming that they got them in a timely fashion, I think that this money is, could have a really significant impact.
I think one thing to build on what Megan was describing is that the ways, so what we can see is money going into families. Then the question is, what do families do with that money? And I think all the question marks that all of us have around the money and the future of this policy may affect the way that families choose to spend it, right? So if I told you your income's going to be higher for the next 6 months and then it might go back down afterward, it's probably not such a great idea to take on an apartment that requires higher rent, right? Or something like that. And so we might see different kinds of allocation decisions with the money because of the unknown nature of the future of the program for now. And that could look really different if this program does get extended and become permanent, where families can rely on this money from month to month and then can feel safe, maybe taking on that, taking on a car payment or taking on, a higher rent or something like that. So it sort of remains to be seen how this will look going forward. Not just in terms of the money coming in, but the way that families feel safe to spend that money.
Elaine, did you have anything you wanted to add there? No, you're good. Okay. So, we've had actually a number of questions from folks who are sort of interested in what the three of you think about what evaluation is going to look like for this. What are the three of you interested in terms of like studying the impact of this? Sarah, I know you looked at and talked about not just looking at families, but also communities, sort of thing. Sarah, would you start us off? Like, what are you paying attention to, or what do you think folks should be paying attention to?
Sure. So my endorsement of looking at communities is something I'm hoping somebody else does, since that's not the kind of research I do. So I'm looking forward to reading whoever's going to go do that research. We have some research in the field right now where we're doing longitudinal research, working with lower income families with children and following them over time. So because we have been interviewing them and we'll continue to interview and survey them, I'm looking to see how they talk about this experience of this money coming in, how they think about it. Do they think about it differently because it's these periodic payments, different than a lump sum? Do they think about it differently because it's a check coming from the IRS versus, other kinds of income support? So I'm looking forward to learning about those things in our ongoing research. And as I'm sure you've gotten a sense of, I'm really interested in how families think about and allocate this money. And so those will be some of the things I'm paying attention to as we move forward.
So I think several groups are interested in surveying families, and the things that I'm sort of interested in seeing is, do we see food insecurity drop more for families with children than families without children? Do we see changes in childcare situations? Like, are people relying on paid childcare? Does that enable, someone to go to work, at least temporarily? So I'm trying to think about, like, what hardships have we just seen go through the roof lately? And do we see those tamped down? And then, some clever economists will hopefully figure out, how do you compare, the piece that's the economy recovering versus this extra cash coming in?
Okay. Megan?
Yeah, I was just going to add that echo all of those pieces. And, there's lots of groups who have sort of ongoing surveys, and some groups, mobilized very quickly during COVID. And they're going to, organizations have been very actively thinking about how to add questions in. My colleagues at Columbia, we have a New York City specific project called the Poverty Tracker, which, we've also been building in questions to enter in, this spring and early summer to try and get that sort of pre-period, and then also, hopefully then be able to compare as it comes out. So I think hopefully, researchers are eager to see what's available, but we also know that many other countries have some kind of child allowance, a version of this sort of regular paid out child tax credit payment, and they've had them in place for a long time. And research in those countries have shown really positive effects over the longer term, that we don't have this window at the moment with the temporary credit, positive impacts on children's health, well-being. And there is some expenditure data from other countries like the UK that, spending went on children's items went up, when cash benefits dedicated to children went up. And there's things that showing, connections to the labor market and things like that for looking at the parents. So I think too, it's something that if hopefully we see a more permanent or longer term version of this type of expansion, there's a lot of evidence that can continue to be collected in addition to what we'll hopefully also find in the short term.
Okay, so we are essentially out of time for today. Sarah has been sharing a White House kind of flyer with information that you can share with families. So I'm just going to drop that in the chat to everyone. But in the meantime, I want to just give each of the three of you an opportunity to kind of share like a parting thought with us. Like what should we be paying attention to? What are you thinking about this? And Elaine, you started us off today. Would you start us off here?
Sure. So my takeaway from all this is that, you should never give up. You should always continue to fight for policies that serve the people you care about, and that we can do big, hard things as a country. And even though we're going to make some mistakes along the way, we should keep trying.
Okay, Megan, would you go?
Yeah, I think to echo that, this is a really exciting time. We talked about a lot of technical details here, but this is potentially a game changer for children and for families. And so, getting two things, getting access, for those so that they can actually reap the benefits of this in the short term, and then also pushing for longer term version of it, because we're at an exciting period, but we also could very quickly see all of this progress lost.
Okay, and Sarah?
To all those of you who are doing direct service work with families, I just want to say thank you for doing that work. And we've just tasked you with doing more on your already full plates of helping families to make sure that they're connecting with the resources that they're eligible for. So I want to share my appreciation for that work. And then also just say that I really hope that we can appreciate the task that we're asking parents to take on of adding this temporary money to their budgets and figuring out what it makes most sense to serve their children with those resources. And so we're going to trust parents to do well by their children. And I think that trust is deserved.